Hello and welcome to Speak Your Mind on Gold FM, only the classic hits. This is the only classic hits radio station in Fiji. I'm Louise. Thank you for your company. Our guest in the studio today, well, he's been very nice enough to come by and talk to us. He's the director of the Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission. Mr. Ashwin Raj, Bula Vinaka to you, and thank you for your time.
Bula Louise, Bula Fiji, thanks so much for having me on your show.
Yes, well, it's wonderful to have you. But before we move on with the topic of human rights, where did you grow up, Mr. Raj?
I'm from Suva. I grew up in Suva, and then I went to the US to do my master's, and I embarked on a PhD in Australia, but really from Suva, and this is home.
Wonderful. So, yeah, that makes the two of us, born and bred in Suva. But maybe we'll just start off with when was the Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission formed in Fiji?
Okay. The provision for the establishment of a human rights commission was provided for under the 1997 Constitution under Section 42.
Mm-hmm.
And then, it was further supplemented by the Human Rights Commission Act of, 1999. And then the Human Rights Commission was established in 1999. Now, the Human Rights Commission Act was then replaced by the Human Rights Commission Decree number 11 of 2009.
Right.
And one of the important things, and further provided for under Section 45 of the 2013 Constitution.
Okay.
Now, one of the interesting things about the provisions under the 1997 Constitution and the current Fijian Constitution is the added scope of anti-discrimination. So we are not just the Human Rights Commission, but we are the Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission.
Okay.
And I think the provision of non-discrimination is extremely important.
Absolutely.
And that's something which is underscored in our present constitution.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, how you had the anti-discrimination in there. Because, I mean, I suppose every trouble in the world is because of some discrimination of some sort. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what are human rights,
Right.
Mr. Raj?
And that's a fundamental question, I think, that we need to think about. Human rights are rights that are inherent in all human beings, regardless of our nationality, our sex, ethnic origin, religion, or language, or any other marker of difference. So they are inherent rights that you have by virtue of the fact that you are a human being.
So you're born with them.
You're born with them, right?
Right.
And these rights are interrelated, they're interdependent, and they're indivisible. So it's not like one right is preponderant or privileged over other forms of rights. And they're intersectional. Because when we look at discrimination, when we look at violence, it's also intersectional.
Right.
You are discriminated against by virtue of maybe your gender, and then you're further marginalized because of your ethnicity, or because of your disability,
Right.
or your status in society. And so I think people need to start thinking about these intersectional forms of violence, and which is why we keep thinking about rights to be indivisible as well. When we think about it, that no one right is privileged over other rights, that they are all equally important.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense to me anyhow. But, I mean, what is the duty of the Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission?
Right. So I want to begin by giving the members of the public some context about how the Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission came about. And I think that two fundamental things. One is that when you look at the idea of human rights, they are actually expressed and guaranteed by law.
They really are.
So,
Law? Like
yes,
in a court of law?
In a court of law. And this is why, our Constitution has the Bill of Rights. Chapter 2 of the Constitution is called the Bill of Rights. And, if you look at our Constitution, the Bill of Rights is really what I've always said is the soul of the Constitution.
Right.
It's a living, breathing document. And the Bill of Rights basically sort of outlines what your basic rights are. But one of the things that the Bill of Rights actually does is it says that when you interpret the Bill of Rights and when you apply the provisions of the chapter, it must be in the spirit of democracy, the underlying principles of democracy,
Right.
Around issues of dignity, equality, and freedom.
Right.
So as we understand the Bill of Rights and the kind of rights that are entailed in our Bill of Rights, we must interpret it along those democratic principles. But two, it also says under Section 7 of the Constitution, which affirms Section 3 in terms of the democratic interpretation of the Bill of Rights. But Section 7 also reminds us that we must also apply wherever applicable international law.
Right.
So in a fundamental sense, the establishment of something like the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission is not purely a response of the national polity. It's also because there are international laws and principles that the state is obligated in observing,
Right.
and in promoting and protecting.
Okay.
So that's the fundamental thing, Louise, that, why human rights are important is because they're guaranteed by law. And then it obligates, states to act in a particular way. It also, encourages and obligates the state to refrain from acting in ways in which
It's
it
not supposed
undermines,
to.
basic rights and fundamental freedoms of individuals and groups.
Mhm.
And so, and this all emanates from the fact that human rights are universal and inalienable. So if you look at the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, 1948, it affirms that the states are duty bound to protect and promote all human rights and fundamental freedoms, regardless of the political, the economic, or the cultural context. So you can't possibly argue that because we are this special state in this particular cultural construct, I'm sorry, we don't recognize human rights. These are inalienable rights. These are universal rights. And when the states ratify, core human rights treaties, they then become legally bound
Okay.
to observe and protect and promote those rights in concrete terms. And I think that's the fundamental thing, that the state is legally bound. It's not one of those things where you can choose and say, well, perhaps we won't do this. There
Mhm.
needs to be very, very solid reasons as to why the state is not fulfilling its obligation.
Yes.
Otherwise,
because-
they can be taken to court.
Exactly. That is, they do have a human rights court internationally. So, I mean, if they're not following it locally, they can even end up there.
And this is why you have something like the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission to enforce those human rights norms,
I see.
to protect, to monitor progress on human rights. And I just want to say that when we think about human rights, the state is not the only actor which is in the purview of human rights. You must think about the state, you must think about the private sector, you must think about civil society organizations, any actor, public or private, and they're all embroiled, because sometimes what happens is stereotypically we're only thinking about the state and its obligations. But human rights, sometimes we forget that,
Right across the board.
human rights also applies to the home.
Exactly.
Human rights applies to the bedroom. Sometimes people think that in the realm of the private we can't think about rights. That is not true.
Okay, well, that's very interesting.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Raj. We've just run out of time for now, but we'll be back shortly on Speak Your Mind on Gold FM, only the classic hits. Welcome back to Speak Your Mind on Gold FM, only the classic hits. And we have the director of the Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission, Mr. Ashwin Raj. And well, I know you were appointed the director 2.5 months ago. So maybe you'd like to share what you have seen, which can be seen as an achievement maybe from the Human Rights Commission.
Okay. Since my appointment, the several important things that I think the Commission's actually done. First of all, the Commission made a very, very successful amicus application. By amicus, for members of the public who may not have legal, facility to legal language, basically means a friend of the court. And we made a very, very successful amicus application on the rights of children under detention. And one of the very, very positive, outcomes of our application was that the High Court made a decision basically upholding the rights of the child, as is provided under our Constitution,
Yes.
for children that were detained, unlawfully detained, and the judge, ordered that these regressive orders be reversed. And I think that's a huge achievement for our Commission to be able to make those kind of applications. Two, the Commission has just made a very, very strong submission on the ratification of the to Parliamentary Standing Committee on Defence and Security on the ratification of the rights of persons with disability without reservation. And I think that's a very important core human rights treaty. And if ratified, Fiji would have made a huge stride there. We also celebrated the International Day Against Homophobia, Biphobia, and Transphobia, which is very, very important as part of our anti-discrimination scope of our work.
Yes.
The Commission has got a draft strategic plan. And so where we sort of outline the various activities that we will actually take as a Commission to enforce human rights norms, to monitor, and to protect and promote human rights on the ground. And one of the ways in which we do that is through a very strong education and advocacy program.
Right.
Yes.
So when you said about the children, you said when they were being detained and you applied for that. So maybe could you give an example of why you had to do that? What was happening?
So one of the issues that the Commission was very concerned about is the fact that if you look at various human rights laws, for instance, the provisions in the Bill of Rights on the rights of the child, but also if you look at international law, one of the things that they all say is that children must not be detained, right?
Okay.
And that they must be in a safe space, and the welfare of the child is important is paramount at all times. And in this instance, children were detained for a consecutive number of days, and thereby basically we felt that the conditions were basically contrary to the best interest of the child, that they should never be in custody in the first place. They should have been held in a safe space, maybe facilitated by some entity like the Department of Social Welfare.
Right.
And so we already have the 48-hour rule, whereby people need to be presented in court. You cannot delay justice because justice delayed is justice denied.
Yes.
But in the event of a child, I think it becomes much more pressing that the welfare of the child and the rights of the child are protected at all times, which our Constitution provides for, but so does international law. So we felt that it was important that we act.
Okay, so this is like in regards to maybe stealing or criminal activities.
Exactly. I mean, the claim is that the children were complicit in an act, which was transgressive. But at the same time, that does not. One of the things that I think people need to realize is that, and I hear a lot of these discussions, particularly when something very, very heinous happens. If there's a crime of rape or something like that, people write things around. We must bring back the death penalty. Somebody needs to be castrated.
Or they start swearing straight away and accusing the person before he is proven guilty.
Exactly. And the one thing that I wanted to emphasize is that our Constitution, through our Bill of Rights, actually provides for the rights of accused and detained persons.
Okay.
And we must observe those rights at all times and separate it from our moral judgment.
Okay.
Because it's natural. People get very angry. I mean, when something happens, people get very emotional, they get very upset, and they want something to happen. But that's when we need to remind people that even accused persons, people who are detained, they have rights too.
Right.
And because they don't cease to be human.
Yep.
Even if we think that, this act was a very, very, animalistic act, they don't cease to be human. And so by virtue of the fact that they're human beings, they have certain rights that we must, protect at all times.
Yes. I mean, gosh, the court of law is there to prove them guilty.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you cannot be painting a picture which you don't know yourself is true or not. That's the court to decide, right?
Exactly. Absolutely.
Yes. Okay, so that's really interesting because I know even for a fact just normal people who do get arrested, a lot of them do not know their rights, that they have to be released, after 48 hours?
Yes, 48 hours. I mean, they have to be presented, in a court, and because they cannot be unduly sort of detained against their will. And this is why, I mean, the law is very clear on these things. And this is why there's international law that compels us to sort of which is that compels us to be fully compliant with international human rights law.
Okay.
So, I mean, one of the things that we're doing, Louise, I mean, and this is a very significant step on the part of the Fijian government to have ratified the Convention Against Torture. What we're now doing is we are working very closely with the police commissioner, who I think is very progressive, because there's been numerous instances where we've raised, issues of human rights as it pertains to the police conduct. The commissioner has been very effective. He's been very forthcoming. I'm working very closely with the Fiji Women's Crisis Center in human rights training for the police. And we're doing a training this week in the West. And the commissioner is very receptive to those things. And one of the things we're trying to do from the perspective of the commission is to constructively engage the police force and the leadership of the police force. Because what we would like to do is to secure a human rights wall in every police station. Basically, what that would mean is when members of the public come, they can say, okay, so what are my basic rights when I'm detained in the police station? What are the legal consequences if I were to give up my right to legal counsel? Who do we call in the event that I feel that my rights have been impinged upon, I've been brutalized, my statements are not being recorded, the police is conducting themselves in a particular way that is contrary and impinges on my basic human rights. So we thought, a wall like that, a human rights wall like that would be very important.
Well, that's really good. I mean, it all comes down to being educated and trying to learn, and then I'm suppose that is your job to get everyone to know exactly what to do. But we'll be back shortly on Speak Your Mind, Gold FM, only the classic hits. Welcome back. Speak Your Mind on Gold FM, only the classic hits. Thank you a lot for your company. And we have the director of the Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission, Mr. Ashwin Raj, who is, giving us the meaning of what human rights really mean. And, it's really interesting to know that there are a lot of people I know in our country that are not aware of what their rights are. So what does the Commission plan in making sure that they are educated on these rights?
Absolutely. And I think that's an important issue. First of all, people need to have the knowledge that they have the right to have rights. Human rights are not specifically for one particular ethnic group or one particular racial group or one particular gender. It's for everybody, and human beings have the right to have rights, and every Fijian in this country has the right to have rights, because that's what our constitution says. They must have the right to live a life free from discrimination, a life of equality, and the life of dignity. That's extremely important. And I think that we need to start thinking about, well, what does this all actually mean in very practical terms? And I think that the Commission, because it's empowered under the Human Rights Commission decree and Section 45 of the Constitution, one of its biggest mandate is to advocate and promote a culture of human rights. So one of the things we have to do is we need to have a very, very strong education and advocacy program. And I think we need to translate laws, because sometimes laws can be so complicated, the language can be so dense, and people don't understand what these basic things mean.
Exactly.
A number of times we've received complaints to the Commission that also involve the conduct of lawyers who are not basically explaining to people what their basic rights are.
Simply.
And simply. But in some instances, they don't explain, period.
At all.
And we're referring matters to the legal practitioners unit and all of that. But, we are duty bound to explain to people what the law says and what our rights are. So the first thing we need to do is we need to translate. And we need to advocate, and we need to educate. We need to go to various spheres. We need to go to schools. We need to go to communities. We need to go to those, geographically dispersed communities, because sometimes education and advocacy, if it is too suva-centric, too, urbanized, then, we're missing out on a large demographic.
Exactly.
And so translation is very important. What do these laws say? What your rights are? What are the limitations to these rights? I mean, people need to understand that rights come with obligations and responsibilities. Your rights cannot impinge the rights of other people. So you have
Okay.
to observe the rights of other people. So what are the limitations? What does that actually mean? And so how do you enforce your rights? Where do you go to lodge a complaint? And then
Right.
for us as a commission, for the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission to be a credible commission, for people to take us seriously, to say, okay, these people mean business. They're in the business of promoting and protecting rights. We need to be responsive. We need to be very responsive. When public lodges a complaint to us, there's a certain amount of time in which we should be able to acknowledge those complaints. We need to then thoroughly investigate those complaints
Okay.
and not make judgments before having, done our investigation.
Right.
Investigations need to be done in the most independent manner. All complaints need to be addressed by the commission. We cannot exclude some complaints and then engage some complaints. We cannot be selective about which complaints we deal with, which complaints we give serious sort of kind of attention to the exclusion of others. And one thing I wanted to say to the members of the public is, none of your complaints are trivial. I think part of the problem with human rights has been, because it's such a politicized thing, that people always give, prominence to civil and political rights. We've got huge issues around social and economic rights. That's also provided for in our constitution. For instance, the right to adequate housing, the right to water,
Right.
sanitation, and the human rights impact of climate change.
Yes.
Which is a real pressing issue. The right to education, the right to environment, the rights of older persons, issues of poverty, issues around sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, issues around disability, and discrimination on prohibited grounds. For instance, we still have advertisements that run in the mainstream media that say, looking for a house girl must be of this particular ethnicity.
Oh, yes,
Looking for tenants, but it has to be of this particular, ethnicity.
It's something that you've brought that up, because I used to
Absolutely.
read that and I wasn't happy at all.
And I think that people need to realize that that's contrary to Section 26 of our Constitution.
Right.
It is unconstitutional, and the media needs to realize that they cannot reproduce those things. I know advertising brings money, but at the same time, you are also obligated to observe these constitutional provisions. For instance, one of the things the Commission is trying to do is, I was at the maternity unit in the hospital, and they still have tags like Indian.
Oh, okay.
And I'm thinking, these are retrogressive tags.
Okay.
The Constitution provides for common and equal citizenry. So why are we identifying people by their ethnic groups? And what is the purpose of that? So I think we need to have a very, very thorough discussion about those things. What do the tags actually do? Because if you look at the tags, in everyday discussion, people still say, if there's a robbery, and they automatically go, well, which Itoke gentleman was that? The people automatically presume that there's a relationship between ethnicity and crime. There's a certain kind of stereotyping going on.
Exactly.
And I think that our Constitution, for all the right reasons, actually sort of associates, anti-discrimination provisions, non-discriminatory provisions with the principle of equality. And I think that it's not accidental that the issue of equality comes together with non-discrimination. So why is it that individual organizations and institutions and people who are advertising and people who are advertising for things like, tenants and for job applications still have these tags? House girls, they still have these tags.
That's just on.
This is plain discriminatory.
Exactly.
And we need to exercise self-reflexivity. And I think the media needs to not give prominence to that stuff. The media needs to realize that it cannot aid and abet this project of discrimination. There's no room for that.
It looks like that we've been brought up to just be like that. It's normal. Nothing's wrong with it.
And this is why I went to the hospital, the other week. I was at the maternity unit, and I looked at the tag of this particular patient, and I said to her, is there any particular reason why you've been identified as Indian?
I know.
This individual has the same right to health like any other person.
I know.
Right? So why do you need to distinguish?
What
Because
is the
we
reason?
know very well that by distinguishing people, that's the first marker of difference that then goes out to discriminate people further on the basis of their ethnicity, on the basis of their religion, so on and so forth. But these institutions need to be accessible to everybody. at all times. It's not the privilege of a few.
Exactly. I mean, that's a really good point that you've brought up. And just there's so many types of discrimination.
Absolutely.
I mean, heaps, like you said, it's a broad spectrum, even human rights. So, I mean, you need to put it in simple terms, I suppose, if you would like to educate the public on their rights.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things we should think about is the rights of children. And, certain cultural contexts basically sort of kind of, have this attitude that, if children are affirming their rights, is often misconstrued as them speaking back.
Yeah, they take it like, oh, that child is a naughty child,
unruly,
not listening.
I mean, I'm the father of the house, I'm the mother of the house, and it's my rules, or else it's the highway.
Okay. Well, I'm so sorry, Mr. Raj. We'll get straight back to that point of the child also having rights in the community. But we'll be back soon on Gold FM, only the classic hits. Speak your mind. Speak Your Mind on Gold FM, only the classic hits. And yes, our friend here, the director of the Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission, Ashwin Raj, and we were just talking about children's rights, how we were saying that, they're normally told just to listen and not to talk. So what would you like to add on to that?
I mean, I'm very troubled by that. Given the enormous reported cases of violence against children, including sexual violence and all of that, we need to recognize that our children need to have the safe space in which they can speak their mind. They need to be, told that they have basic rights, the right to be able to go to school and come home safely, the right to be able to go to church without being violated, and so on and so forth. The right to be able to freely express themselves. And these rights are provided for under Section 41 of the Constitution. So let's not, think that if a child is talking about certain issues that affects them within the bounds of reason and respect, that should not be misconstrued as questioning the hegemony of the father of the house. I mean, they're basic human rights because children are sovereign subjects with rights.
Yes.
And sometimes we forget that because we have a very, very collectivized attitude about rights. Rights are not simply for adults only. Rights are there for children as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that given the fact that children are already very, very vulnerable demographic, and they're very, very susceptible to various violations and incrimination, that all the more reason we empower and encourage our children to recognize what their rights are, to protect their rights. We create a safe space in which they're able to speak their mind, because the last thing we want is a child who is passive, a child who grows up in an environment where he or she feels completely disparaged, has no self-esteem, feels that they have no basic rights, and that's the beginning of violation.
Yes.
So we need to encourage our children. We need our children to flourish.
To be vocal.
They need to be vocal. They need to be educated. They need to be worldly. They need to know that they can trust people and they can speak their mind at home. Because when they feel confident at home, they come out in the public sphere, they go to school, they go to work. These are vocal, independent, critical thinkers. Their imaginative fecundity flourishes.
I mean, imagine they are actually the future leaders of the country.
Absolutely.
And we need to bring them up to be smart.
So let's not clip the wings before the imagination takes flight.
True.
Let them flourish.
Yes, exactly. Now, also just on discrimination of religion, this one is really sensitive.
Yes.
And, I can't understand how, like, for example, I will use Islam, okay? Now, these terrorists, they are causing all these problems in the world, okay? And like for a normal, good living Muslim, they are being oppressed for the action of these few terrorists. And this is, I mean, a huge discrimination. So they just say, they just say, Islam, that's a a religion of a devil or something like that. So, I mean, human nature, I can't understand why they don't see someone as an individual instead of putting them into groups.
Absolutely. There's several things I want to say in relation to religion, Louise. I mean, first of all, the Constitution provides for a secular state. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what secular state means. Secular state basically means, and I'm not a lawyer, but this is my interpretation, that secular state basically means that a state will not have a specific religious orientation. Right?
Right.
And secularism then should not be seen as an enemy of one's religious values. Secular state means that you still have the fundamental right and the freedom to celebrate your own religious diversity.
Which you have chosen.
Which you have chosen. It could be Islam, it could be Christianity, it could be Hinduism,
Buddhism.
whatever it is. The state, on the other hand, because it is an abstract structure of redress and no one owns the state, must be secular at all times. It has no religious orientation, so that it doesn't give any preference, undue preference to one group of people over others.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Because the state has to be equal to everybody.
Yes.
The state has to be non-discriminatory.
Right, yes.
So, but on the other hand, I think what's also happened, and Fiji is no exception, is that there's a lot of stereotyping going on, where people are associating certain religious communities with extremism and so on and so forth, which is problematic. I mean, if you look at our social media, there's so much Islamophobia at this point.
Yes, in the
and
world
this is
over.
why I think the media and other, public intellectuals, religious scholars need to come out and talk about the importance of reason and exercising reason, because I think the importance of exercising scopic reason which is untroubled by perspective, is so important at this time, because sometimes, I mean, I think the politicization of religion for political gain, it does enormous amount of damage, particularly when we want to work towards a world which is peaceful, a world which is tolerant, a world which celebrates diversity, because that is our strength. And I think that sometimes I look at, the kinds of discussions we have in the social media, even in Fiji.
Yes.
There's so much religious, there's so much bigotry and so much hate. I mean, the things that essentially, if you look at our constitutional definition, it's tantamount to hate speech. So you cannot build democracy on discrimination. You cannot build democracy on fear. You cannot build democracy on hate. So I think part of the problem is that, people, because they are so caught up in political fault lines and differences, then descend to that other level where they begin to attack people's religious orientation.
I mean, like I said, they actually, make them all into one group.
Yeah, and they collapse, they stereotype without looking at, the fact that if you look at most of the religious, texts, it's built on love and peace.
Exactly.
I mean, that seems to be the basic message. I mean, I'm not religious at all, but at the same time, as somebody who reads all the scriptures, I mean, that's a fundamental message that comes through.
That's right.
So,
I mean, we'd say, basically, I would want you to have a life as I'm living, a happy life as a human being. I mean, that's how we should look at it. I mean, know the difference of good and bad, and just don't discriminate.
Yeah.
But we will be back shortly on Gold FM. Speak your mind. Gold FM, only the classic hits. Speak your mind. Thank you so much for your company. And we continue with our very interesting live talkback show on radio. This is with the director of the Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission. And this is Ashwin Raj. Really nice talking to you. I mean, just to know the value of human rights is very important. And I think we've been sharing about, how we spoke about religion. It's a world thing. So maybe you'd like to continue from there.
Yes, I think that's an important conversation, because Fiji is such a diverse country. And the fact that we're so fortunate that we're a peaceful country.
Absolutely.
And we must sustain that. It's only because the strength of our democracy lies in our diversity. And I think that exercising reason, around very, very sensitive issues such as religion is going to be extremely important. And there are times when, because of political divisions and political differences, people descend to racial and religious incrimination. I give you an example. When there was a discussion on the social media about what the next flag should look like.
Right.
And, there's some proposals which, had, stars on them and crescent on them and so on and so forth. And people were saying, oh, so we are now going to be an Islamic state.
Oh,
and there
dear.
are others who were trying to link it with Israel and all of that. And I was thinking to myself, how do we denaturalize and decouple symbols and stereotypes and so on and so forth? And make a simple aesthetic judgment without necessarily reading too much into it. But then it just got me thinking that, this is what happens when you do not emancipate your imagination.
Yes,
when
exactly.
you're so thoroughly shackled by bigotry
That's a good
and
one.
hate and hate and contempt, that you can't think beyond the fact that maybe other than your religion, there are other religious groups too that exist, that diversity is an important thing, that it needs to be celebrated, that difference is a good thing, that it needs to be celebrated, and that we must engage with reason even if we may differ.
That's so important, to engage in reason. I mean, just don't be so judgmental.
Exactly.
I mean, just want for your brother what you'd like for yourself. And I mean, this world would be such a more beautiful place to live in. We
Absolutely.
wouldn't be having wars and everything like that if everyone, followed what human rights is trying to, tell the whole
Indeed.
world, which is very simple. It's just, like I said, having your fellow human being, brother or sister, live a life of happiness as you are. You have the right to it.
Yeah, I think that's a very astute observation, because if you look at the Universal Declaration for Human Rights, 1948, it is out of the context of a war. Immediately after a war, that, people declare that, human beings have certain rights that states need to protect, regardless of the historical, political, cultural context.
Yes.
And so that's a very sober reminder. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it is because, I mean, you don't want to listen to what someone else is telling you. Like you said, you've got to have your own logical reason and just look at it in a peaceful and, a loving way. And I'm sure everything would be all right. But I know this is our last segment. So I just thought maybe to ask you, Mr. Raj, about human rights issues in Fiji.
So, like I said earlier, other than, civil and political rights, that has been given a lot of prominence. I mean, particularly around, freedom of expression. And, in my other capacity as the chairman of the media industry, I've encouraged that, the media be able to operate freely in this country. Individuals with dissenting voices be able to exercise their free speech. And I've also reminded people that if you're critical of state policies, that is not an act of sedition. It's your democratic right to be critical of policies and to demand accountability and so on and so forth. So, we are very committed under the Constitution too to promote freedom of expression. And I'm very pleased to say that even those people who claim that there is so much self-censorship or smart censorship have those views published in the newspaper. And that's the only reason why I know there's censorship, because they get published. So
Yes.
I'm very pleased that the spaces are open. Then there are other issues beyond civil and political rights, I think, that we need to pay serious attention to in this country. The right to housing, the right to water, the right to sanitation, rights of the child, rights of women, issues to do with disability. The human rights impact of climate change is an important, a very pressing one. The rights of the elderly, issues of poverty, entrenched sort of inequality because of income and so on and so forth. Those are the issues I think that require a lot of attention, and that can only be achieved if an entity like the Fiji Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission constructively works with the government, with civil society organizations. There's a problem in this country. Whenever we engage, people think, oh, that person's a sellout. They're working now with the government. They're a mouthpiece of the government. No, we need to hold institutions to account. And we can only do that if we constructively engage. So we don't want to be on the side of anybody. We don't want to be on the side of the government. We don't want to be on the side of civil society. But we're not against them either, because the goal is collective. The goal is promotion and protection of human rights for all Fijians at all times, everywhere. That's the most important thing. And I think we should never, ever stray from that collective goal, no matter what our political differences are. Put that aside, come in the room and engage.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we could go on forever
Sure.
talking about this. I mean, it is a really important subject, but just before we leave, just maybe if you could give an address or a way of contact for someone who has maybe a complaint to make
Sure,
to the Human Rights Commission.
Absolutely. I would encourage, all Fijians, to feel free to, visit us at the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission at Level 2, Naimbati House, 9 Goodenough Street. You can also call us on 330-8577. You can email me at director@fhrc.org.fj. But I just wanted to say that beyond complaints, if you would like to make a submission to the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission to look at various human rights issues, perhaps you have suggestions about how we can do our job effectively. We welcome that. We value your input. The Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination Commission is open to all members of the public, and we would very much appreciate your input in advancing human rights for all.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you very much, Mr. Raj, human rights defender. Good luck with the job. And on Speak Your Mind, we have come to an end. We'll talk to you again next week. Be sure to listen in then. It's live on radio, and we have the delayed coverage on FBC TV every Tuesday nights and Wednesday mornings. Vinakavakalevu, Modemanda.